The people who once hoped outside pressure might weaken their own government are now directing their anger somewhere else entirely, toward Donald Trump, toward the United States, toward the airstrikes that devastated parts of their own country. That reversal, unexpected, emotional, and deeply complicated, is now unfolding inside Iran after joint U.S.-Israel strikes damaged civilian infrastructure, residential areas, and historic cultural sites. And the reaction coming from some Iranians who previously opposed their own government is not what many outside observers expected, because the people speaking out now are not necessarily defenders of the regime. Some of them were critics, some were protesters, some were activists who had once believed that pressure from abroad, perhaps even force, might weaken the power structure they opposed. But after the strikes, the reality on the ground changed the conversation, and the shift in mood has been swift. Let me walk you through how that happened. Before we move forward, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to support independent, fact-driven reporting. The airstrikes carried out by the United States and Israel hit parts of Iran and caused widespread damage. Reports describe civilian infrastructure being struck. Residential areas were damaged. Historic cultural sites were also affected. Think about what that means on a human level, not policy, not geopolitics. Homes, neighborhoods, places where people live their daily lives, places where families sleep, places where history has stood for generations. When those kinds of places are hit, the consequences ripple outward far beyond the original target. Residents across the country are now describing something that goes beyond physical destruction. Fear, uncertainty, a sense that the ground beneath daily life has suddenly shifted, and that feeling is spreading. Reports say many residents are now expressing deep anxiety about what comes next. Military operations are ongoing, and that uncertainty about whether more strikes may come has created a climate of tension that is difficult to escape. Imagine waking up each day not knowing if another strike might occur. Imagine hearing that residential areas, places like your own, have already been damaged. That changes how people think. It changes what they focus on. It changes who they blame. And in this moment, some of the voices expressing anger are coming from people who previously directed their criticism toward the Iranian government itself. That fact is important because it reveals something about how quickly public perception can shift when civilian life is disrupted. Before the strikes, certain protesters and activists inside Iran had hoped that international pressure, perhaps even foreign intervention, might weaken the government they opposed. That hope, according to the reports now emerging, was rooted in the belief that external pressure could alter the balance of power. But when the strikes landed, the reality did not look like political change. It looked like destruction. Civilian infrastructure damaged, residential neighborhoods affected, historic cultural sites harmed, and suddenly the consequences were no longer abstract. They were immediate, they were personal, they were visible in daily life, and that has changed the emotional tone of the conversation. Instead of seeing the strikes as a tool that might weaken the government, some of those same voices now say the attacks have worsened conditions for civilians. Worsened. That word carries weight because it suggests that whatever political calculations may have existed before the strikes, the lived experience afterward has produced a very different conclusion. Fear has increased. Uncertainty has spread. And the damage to civilian areas has altered how some people view the role of outside military force. There is a short phrase that captures the emotional core of this moment. War always lands on ordinary lives. That line does not assign blame. It does not predict outcomes. It simply reflects a truth that becomes visible whenever conflict touches civilian spaces, homes, streets, cultural landmarks, daily life. For many residents, those are the places now associated with the strikes, and that association matters because public reaction inside a country is rarely static. It shifts, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. Right now, reports indicate that public frustration is growing as military operations continue, not just frustration about politics, frustration about the consequences being felt by civilians. The atmosphere inside the country, according to residents speaking about the situation, is marked by heightened anxiety and uncertainty about what the ongoing military activity could bring next. And when people feel uncertain about their safety, their priorities change. Political calculations become secondary. Security becomes primary. Protection becomes urgent. That shift can reshape public sentiment in ways that outside observers sometimes struggle to anticipate, especially when the voices speaking now are people who once hoped foreign pressure might weaken the system they opposed, because their expectations were different, their hopes were different, and now the results they are experiencing look very different as well. The destruction reported from the strikes, civilian infrastructure, residential areas, cultural sites, has created a reality that some residents say has intensified hardship rather than relieving it. That tension is now shaping public conversation. And it is happening against the backdrop of ongoing military operations, which means the situation is not static. It is still unfolding, still evolving, still producing reactions that may continue to change as events move forward. But here is the question quietly emerging beneath all of this. If some of the people who once opposed their own government are now expressing anger at outside military action instead, what does that mean for how the conflict is being understood inside the country itself? Because that shift, subtle but powerful, could shape everything that comes next. And what happened after the strikes may explain why that change in perception is spreading. The shift in public reaction did not happen in a vacuum. It began with expectations that had existed quietly among some Iranians who opposed their own government long before the recent airstrikes took place. For certain protesters and activists, the idea of outside pressure had once carried a specific meaning. The belief was that international action, possibly including military pressure, might weaken the governing system they were criticizing. That belief did not exist everywhere. It was not universal, but it existed. And for those who held it, the expectation was simple in concept, even if the reality of politics is never simple. Pressure from outside might create change inside. Then the strikes happened, and the details reported afterward quickly began to reshape that expectation. The United States and Israel carried out airstrikes in Iran. Reports from inside the country say those strikes damaged civilian infrastructure. Residential areas were affected. Historic cultural sites were also damaged. Let that sink in for a moment. Civilian infrastructure means the systems that allow daily life to function, the facilities people depend on, the structures that support communities. Residential areas mean homes, not symbolic buildings, not political offices, homes. And historic cultural sites carry a different kind of meaning altogether. These are places tied to memory, heritage, and identity. When such places are damaged, the impact is not measured only in physical terms. It resonates in how people understand the loss of history itself. Picture that emotional landscape. Imagine communities already living within a tense political environment, and then suddenly facing damage to the places that anchor everyday life. The conversation changes almost immediately. Reports now describe residents across Iran expressing fear and uncertainty after the strikes. Fear about the safety of their surroundings, uncertainty about whether further military action might occur. Those feelings do not remain contained within a single neighborhood or city. When events like this unfold, the emotional effect spreads through conversations, through families, through communities sharing what they have heard and experienced. And that is exactly what appears to be happening. Many residents say the attacks have increased anxiety across the country. The sense of instability that follows military strikes, especially those affecting civilian spaces, creates a psychological environment where daily life feels less predictable. Think about the rhythm of ordinary life: going to work, walking down familiar streets, returning home in the evening. When the possibility of further strikes exists in the background of those routines, the experience of daily life changes in ways that are difficult to ignore. And that emotional shift is now shaping how some Iranians are responding to the strikes themselves. Protesters and activists who had previously hoped foreign intervention might weaken the Iranian government are now speaking publicly about how the destruction has affected civilians. Their conclusion, according to reports from residents and observers, is stark. They say the attacks have worsened conditions for civilians. That phrase carries consequences because it represents the moment when an expectation meets reality and the two no longer match. Before the strikes, outside pressure may have been viewed through a strategic lens. The idea was about political outcomes. After the strikes, the experience became immediate. Damage to homes, damage to infrastructure, damage to cultural sites, fear spreading across communities. And when those realities enter daily life, they can transform how people interpret events. There's a quiet sentence that captures the emotional turning point of moments like this. When reality arrives, theory disappears. It is not an accusation, it is not a judgment, it is a reflection of how human perception works when circumstances become personal. The reports emerging now suggest that some of the very people who once criticized their government are directing anger toward the United States following the strikes. That reaction may seem surprising to outside audiences, particularly those who assumed opposition to the Iranian government would translate automatically into support for foreign pressure. But human responses to conflict rarely follow simple lines. When the effects of military action are felt inside residential communities, reactions can become complicated, emotional, and sometimes contradictory. One feeling does not cancel another. Opposition to a government can coexist with anger toward foreign military action. Frustration with political leadership can exist alongside fear caused by outside strikes. And that layered emotional reality is now being expressed by residents speaking about what has happened in their neighborhoods. Some say the destruction has created conditions that make life harder rather than easier. Harder in terms of security, harder in terms of stability, harder in terms of daily certainty. Those experiences are shaping public frustration as the situation continues to unfold. Military operations are ongoing, which means the environment remains tense. The possibility of additional developments keeps the sense of uncertainty alive. And uncertainty has a powerful effect on public sentiment. People begin asking questions that have no immediate answers. Will there be more strikes? What areas might be affected next? How long will the situation continue? These questions move through conversations in homes, on streets, within communities, trying to make sense of what has already happened. And every unanswered question adds to the atmosphere of anxiety. Here is how that emotional chain reaction works. First comes the event itself, the strikes and the damage reported afterward. Then comes the realization of what was affected: civilian infrastructure, residential areas, historic cultural sites. Then comes the emotional response: fear, uncertainty, frustration. And finally comes the shift in public reaction. In this case, that shift includes criticism directed at the United States by some individuals who previously focused their criticism primarily on the Iranian government. That development does not erase earlier grievances or disagreements within Iranian society. Those tensions still exist. But the strikes introduced a new factor into the emotional equation: civilian impact. And once that factor enters the conversation, it can reshape how people interpret everything that follows. Residents speaking about the aftermath say the destruction has made conditions worse for civilians rather than improving them. Those words spoken in frustration are part of a broader reaction that reflects how deeply military events can affect public perception inside the country experiencing them. The story, in other words, is not only about the strikes themselves, it is also about the human response afterward. The fears voiced by residents, the frustration expressed by activists, the uncertainty felt by communities wondering what might happen next, and the tension created when expectations about foreign intervention collide with the reality of civilian damage. That collision between what people hoped might happen and what actually occurred is now shaping the national conversation. But there is one final layer to this story, because the reactions emerging now do not only describe anger or fear, they also reveal something deeper about how ongoing military operations can transform public mood across an entire country. And that broader emotional shift may be the most important part of the story still unfolding. There is a moment in any crisis when a single event stops feeling isolated and begins to feel like part of daily life. That moment appears to be arriving now in parts of Iran. After the U.S.-Israel airstrikes damaged civilian infrastructure, residential areas, and historic cultural sites, reports from residents describe something deeper than shock. The initial reaction to the strikes was immediate: fear, confusion, and concern for the safety of neighborhoods and communities. But as time passes, those reactions are beginning to settle into something heavier: a broader national mood shaped by uncertainty. Many residents now say the attacks have increased fear across the country. Not simply fear tied to one location or one incident, but fear connected to the possibility that the situation could continue or escalate as military operations remain ongoing. Think about what that does to the rhythm of life. When military strikes affect residential areas, the boundary between battlefield and neighborhood disappears. Daily routines begin to carry an undercurrent of tension. People still go about their lives, but the feeling beneath those routines changes. And when historic cultural sites are damaged, the emotional effect reaches even further. Cultural landmarks represent shared identity and collective memory. They are part of how a society understands its own history. Damage to those places is not experienced only as physical destruction. It is felt as something personal. Residents speaking about the aftermath describe an environment where uncertainty has become constant. Conversations revolve around what might happen next, how the situation could evolve, and whether additional strikes might occur. In moments like this, the emotional temperature of an entire country can shift. Fear spreads through word of mouth, through families talking with one another, through communities sharing information and speculation about events that have already happened and events that might still come. And that atmosphere of uncertainty is now shaping public frustration. Some of the individuals expressing that frustration are the same protesters and activists who previously hoped foreign intervention might weaken the Iranian government. Before the strikes, the idea of outside pressure carried a particular meaning for them. It suggested the possibility that external forces could influence political change inside the country. But when the strikes damaged civilian areas, the reality on the ground altered how those events were experienced. Reports now indicate that many of those voices say the destruction has worsened conditions for civilians. Worsened. That word has become central to the reaction unfolding inside the country, because it captures the gap between expectation and experience. For people who once believed foreign pressure might help shift the political balance, the damage to homes, infrastructure, and cultural sites has created a different conclusion. The strikes did not feel like relief. They felt like disruption. They felt like danger entering civilian spaces. And that perception is now shaping the emotional landscape inside Iran. Anger directed toward the United States has emerged from some of those voices, even among individuals who previously criticized their own government. The reactions are not uniform, and they do not erase the complex political divisions that exist within Iranian society, but the shift being described by residents reflects how the impact of military action can rearrange public sentiment, especially when civilians feel the consequences directly. There is a short line that captures the gravity of that transformation. Conflict changes people long before it changes borders. It speaks to something deeper than politics. When military operations affect everyday environments, homes, neighborhoods, cultural landmarks, the emotional reaction becomes personal rather than abstract. And personal experiences often shape public perception more powerfully than distant political debates. Residents across Iran now describe a climate of fear and uncertainty created by the strikes and the possibility of continued military activity. The sense that daily life has become less predictable, less stable, less certain. Imagine waking up in a place where recent events have already damaged residential neighborhoods and historic sites. Imagine hearing that military operations are ongoing. The question that begins to echo through communities is simple: what happens next? That question carries weight precisely because there is no immediate answer. And when people cannot predict what comes next, frustration grows alongside fear. That frustration is now visible in the reactions being reported from inside the country. Voices that once directed their energy toward opposing the Iranian government are now expressing anger toward the foreign military actions that caused the destruction they are witnessing. It is a complicated emotional moment, one that reflects how quickly circumstances can reshape perspectives when civilian life becomes entangled with military events. The story unfolding now inside Iran is not only about the airstrikes themselves, it is also about the human response that follows. Fear spreading through communities, residents grappling with uncertainty about future developments, activists and protesters reassessing expectations they once held about foreign intervention, public frustration growing as the effects of the strikes become part of everyday conversation. All of these reactions are occurring against the backdrop of ongoing military operations, which means the emotional climate remains fluid, still evolving, still shifting as new information emerges and as people process the events that have already taken place. What is clear from the reports coming out of Iran is that the strikes have created a moment of profound tension. Civilian infrastructure damaged, residential areas affected, historic cultural sites harmed, and a population now navigating the fear and uncertainty that follow those events. The reaction from some anti-regime voices, anger directed toward the United States rather than toward their own government, reveals how deeply those consequences are being felt, not as distant geopolitical strategy, but as lived experience. And in the end, that may be the most important part of this story, because when conflict touches civilian life, the reaction does not unfold only in government halls or military briefings. It unfolds in homes, in neighborhoods, in conversations among ordinary people trying to understand how their world changed. Sometimes those conversations lead to answers. Sometimes they lead to more questions, but they always reveal something essential about the human cost of conflict. And right now, inside Iran, those conversations are still unfolding.